had nothing but issues getting the sand from the channel in the middle of the barn out to our manure pit. We had all kinds of issues there. And then every 6 months you had all the issues of a big sand dune out in your manure pit. And so when we looked at going to the next stage, I told them, let's go with sawdust and mattresses because I am sick of dealing with sand. It's just, if nothing else, I would dilute down the amount because the extra manure. And he absolutely would not do that. Wouldn't budge, wouldn't even talk about it. So we said, okay, if we're doing sand, we have to change because there's no way. We were going through in our old barn, you roughly figure about a truckload per 100 cows, roughly, a week is what we were using. And that was by no means extra. That was just kind of bare maintenance. And so we went to the sand separation system that we looked at on another farm. It's a closed system. The only fresh water that we're using is on the final rinse. It's very little. And we actually, on the video you saw where we had the M-Tech scrubbers for the parlor, well, through that system we can make chlorine dioxide. And so we actually make extra and take that down to our sand room, inject that into our water line on the final rinse to try and get the sand cleaner yet. And generally on dairy crop, I don't know, our last test was right when it was hot. We're at 126. Our previous year we've been at about 90,000 for our cell count. But with that sand separation system, you just we figure we're getting about 99%. So we might buy, half dozen loads a year or something, It's very little, and the little bit we get out in the pit is like a silt. It's not even really sand, and the cow comfort seems nice. The sand we got's real small, and we just felt like it wasn't a good idea for us, and especially the next generation, to be hauling the equivalent of 15 loads of sand every week out onto the fields. It just, when we did it, I just looked at the paperwork here about 6 months ago. We were cleaning out some drawers, and at that point we figured a 7 to 7.5 year payback on that sand system. And I would guess that's probably pretty accurate, because when I looked at what the costs were and when I figured what the sand was costing us, I just went off of that, because you're going to have you had electricity and you've got some maintenance in the sand room, whereas we were having all kinds of issues in the pit trying to haul the sand out and ruining equipment in the process. Those two cancel each other out. But I think where the profit margin is the cow comfort. If we added an extra 3 to 4 months to a lactation because she's so much more comfortable, then that system probably paid for itself in 5 years, realistically. And right now we're at 10 to 11 in, and the equipment in there is real good shape. Everything's running good. We just keep it on a yearly maintenance plan. Everything seems to run pretty good. So we're real happy with it. It just, if we were going to run sand, that was the only options we had, to be honest with you. So I don't know. And the other thing we did was when we built the cross-fed barn, we did not put any brisket boards or anything in. We had them in the old barn, and when we were going minimum sand, the cows would, kind of knock their knees on them trying to get up and everything. And we said, if we're going to put a sand system in, we're going to have those stalls full. We're not going to run them low, because that was the whole point of putting it in. And he can probably allude to it, we never see a swollen hock or any injuries at all. So I think at the end of the day it was an extremely good investment. It's just a large investment.
Well, when we put the sand in, he builds up in front to almost make a brisket for him, but it's sand. I mean, the cows can move around in it a little bit. Plus when they get up, as well as I do, they drag that sand back a little bit. So that's how we keep the stalls full pretty much. Because when they're lay, the guy that does it, he'll jack that sand pretty high. And he's got to kind of watch it, because where the stalls bolt together, we've kind of had them rot out before, and the manufacturer said, you might want to calm your sand down a little bit, because they're taking those stalls apart. But that's what they usually do. I mean, he builds those fronts up so high that they just work the sand back. So it works out pretty good. Plus the cow's sloped a little bit then, so when she does urinate or defecates, it goes right out into the alleys.
So as you guys are starting to, get your herd's reproduction at all-time levels, you're breeding a healthier herd, you're reducing antibiotics, you're increasing milk production, everything's moving in a great direction. Any future opportunities that you're gonna build on from all of the success and thoughts of where you take this into the future?
Just keep getting better. I mean, you're never, in my point, you're a good manager and excellent. You're always learning. I mean, I'll consider myself a good manager. Mark's a good manager. I wouldn't ever call anyone excellent because you're always learning. And this is just my point of view. I mean, you're always learning something. And the more you talk to people, these meetings, people north of here, south of here, get more ideas. You're always going to keep going and going and going. Now, on our farm, we're kind of locked to, unless we want to bring in half a county worth of dirt and build up because we're on that big hill. We're kind of locked to where we're at. But genetics are going to get better, keep getting better. How much are these cows going to milk? I mean, we can only sell so much milk. But, you know, I'm always, it's just seeing what I know right now from this cow manager and what I knew last year, it's incredible how much you pick up, you know, and that's just 1 year. So I see us just getting, as the genetics get bigger, get more and more, you know, cows are, we average 100 pounds of cow right now. I mean, how much more can we do? You know, on the health, we just bang away, trying to get these cows healthy as possible. You know, 10 years from now, what's going to be like? You know?
Like you say, our footprint is what it is. Building on a hill is a great idea for ventilation, but expansion-wise, it kind of landlocked us. And now with the processors telling you, you can do this much unless you can find somebody else goes out of business and you can find theirs, you know. So right now, I would say we just got to continue to do better on what we've got. And maybe the cropping enterprise gets bigger, or maybe we venture into something else, you know. With all that beef, maybe we get into more, as the breeding keeps going better, and if you increase on your beef, maybe you end up with some type of enterprise that way. So, no major changes right now, because the boys are young. I mean, we got an 18-year-old and two 21-year-olds, so it's not like, you know, they're terribly old yet. So, give them a little time to come in, and we'll go from there.
Some of them need a lot of time.
I have to give a little bit of a laugh here. Hopefully the younger generation will appreciate this. I never thought I'd hear the day where you guys couldn't live without the internet.
Like I say, we embrace things slowly sometimes.
Processor, is that a pound limit or a number of cow limit and unlimited pounds?
It's a pound limit right now. I mean, they're just starting it in January, and they claim they're going to have a 6-month window and revisit it after that. So as of right now, we haven't even told if you go over that what the deduct's going to be. If it's going to be $2 a hundredweight, $5. No, I don't think they've completely have told us exactly yet what that deduct would be, but.
So are you at your limit yet?
Well, currently, right now, we'd be over. Just the feed is just feeding really good right now, and so at that point, depending on what the deduct is, you know, maybe we pull the inputs down a little just to stay at that level and try and be more profitable. It all depends where the milk price is at too, you know. I mean, milk jumps up to $21, $22. Even if you're losing $2, well, it'd be worth it to get that extra. Milk's at $17, you lose that $2, and you're going to be below your cost of production. So, you know, it's going to be a learning phase forever. I think most processors are probably going that direction, so I'm certainly not thinking we're the only ones. And at the end of the day, if it raises the price up to all of us a little better, it's probably a good thing.
Hello, one question. Are you using the cow manager for heat detection on heifers or of 1 year or 11 months?
Excuse me.
Are you using cow manager for heat detection on non-lactating animals or just lactating?
Right now, it's just lactating.
I can talk about, are there any heat stress capabilities with Cow Manager? Like indications on, so competitor product, right? And they have, I think SCR has some sort of algorithm for heavy respiration or is there?
Probably go to a few, Phil.
Sure. Yeah, so the question is there any heat stress or heat abatement type tools within the Cow Manager system? And the answer is yes. Those are brand new. We just launched those this summer, so we're just kind of going through our first learning curve of all that. But yes, it gives you some insights into however you'd like to sort that data, whole herd, lactation by pen, from those types of panting activities, changes in behavior like we've talked about with different lying bouts and stress bouts. So yes, we do have alerts now in there for heat abatement and heat stress.
And for all the settings, like for the rumination, you can set the parameters, right? To pretty much how you want it. Because that's how we did ours, correct?
Correct. Any other last minute questions? All right, I'd like to go ahead and wrap up then. I'd like to throw out a couple thank yous. Thank you to our sponsors again with Select Sires and Cow Manager, Dan Hagenow for the awesome video production. And help me one last time, thank Prairie Land Dairy and the Fahey family for giving up their time today.
Headed by Dr. Mary Beth Paul, research scientist with USDA Agricultural Research Service. I'd like to also remind everybody to please silence your phones.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And good morning, and thank you for being here on this last day of the World Dairy Expo 2021. You know, what would the food supply look like without animal agriculture? I mean, to a point, it's almost asking the question, what does animal agriculture matter? All right? I mean, so first things first, animal agriculture within the United States, it employs 1.6 million people, okay? $31.8 billion in exports, very important economically. We recycle almost 48 million tons of human and edible byproducts from food, fiber, and biofuel. Think of distillers' grains, think citrus pulp, think almond hulls, wheat midds, and on down the line that come from producing food and fuel and fiber, okay? I mean, and besides, there's a whole variety of other products going from adhesives, ceramics, cosmetics, fertilizer, on down the line. A whole variety of products that are made, that are derived from animals that we use in our society, okay? I mean, if you look at the animals we have in agriculture, it's not just about food, it's about many things altogether. The key thing about them is they can convert resources, again, like those byproduct feeds, like forages. They can convert those things that people can't use into things that we can. But you've seen the discussions that show up about livestock in the news. What proportion of the time are the stories positive? Okay, shake your head like this if you think, no. Shake your head like this if you think there's lots of positive. I mean, we do see positive stories out there, but the majority have this kind of look to them, where the livestock industry, is it destroying the planet? Okay, our results suggest that vegetarians have significantly lower ischemic heart disease mortality and overall cancer incidence. Published paper. Researchers say that the only way to guarantee enough food in 2050 is if the world turns vegan. Is this true or not? Okay. And the report that came out of World Health Organization, came out of the UN, was Livestock's Long Shadow, which was indicating that the impact of animal agriculture across the globe was huge, even compared to transportation. Now, for the record, after the fact, they figured out that they did an apples and oranges comparison, because they were counting everything that went into animal agriculture or came out of it from production of feed on down the line. Whereas, if I remember correctly, they were only counting the fuel use within the transportation industry. Whereas you need that whole system to be evaluated to put it in proper perspective. But still, this made a mark. And there is no argument that livestock can pollute water and air, that the operations can, that the animal operations have potential to erode land, cause deforestation, can be inefficient, compete with people for food and water. And these are some of the things that are making the main headlines. So somewhere back a decade or more ago, some of us were looking at this question and wondering what would happen if we did indeed get rid of animal agriculture. What would the U.S. at the very least look like? But because we started thinking about food webs and sustainability. How many of you learned about food webs in school? Okay? And what we've got is sunlight coming in and growing plants, insects and so forth, and animals and so forth end up eating the plants. Other predators will then end up eating the things that eat the plants. Any and all of this will die. They'll feed the plants, it'll go into the system, it'll feed the bacteria. And we have a food web where everything depends on everything else for how long it is sustained. I mean, what the food webs do is they show how resources cycle through systems, and balance within a system determines its sustainability. Now, the thing we don't often consider is that human society has its own food web. Think about that one for a moment. I mean, we've got, in our food web, we have human society, we have animal agriculture, and we have plant agriculture. And this is what the trade-offs back and forth in our food web look like. Like, for instance, with human society, producing fiber, producing biofuels, producing food, we have byproduct feeds that we feed back to animal agriculture, and they send back food, fiber, biofuel, and other products. When we go down to plant agriculture, they send food, fiber, biofuel, and other products to human society, and human society sends back fertilizer and biosolids. And then between the plants and the animals, we have the trade-off of feed and fertilizer, at the very least. So if you look at the concept of animal agriculture being something that's worth getting rid of for the harm that it does, if that's your perspective, what you also have to do is ask the question, what happens if you got rid of it? Because that's what you seriously have to look at if we're dealing with how our entire food web is sustainable or is not. Okay? So the question that Dr. Robin White, she is a professor at Virginia Tech, what she and I asked was, would the U.S. food supply and meeting the nutrient requirements of people in the U.S., what would it look like if we removed farmed livestock? Seems a pretty basic question if going vegan by 50-50 is the way we're going to save the planet. And for the record, okay, I forgot to tell you, okay, I am from the federal government, USDA Agricultural Research Service. I am a research scientist, and I work in dairy cattle nutrition, okay? And to do this project, I also have 5 dogs, and intelligent people don't have more than 2. Okay, all that said, to do this project, I had to go to my center director and ask permission to do this project, because it's not exactly dairy cattle nutrition. Not really. And so he gave me permission, and then he stopped, and he looked at me, and he said, well, what if it turns out that we'd be better off without animal agriculture? Well, that kind of stopped me, and then I looked at him, I said, well, that would be good to know. You know, because the point of science, whatever way the data pans out, is you got to be transparent, you got to put it out there, you got to be as honest as you possibly can, because it can matter for how we're going to live and how we're going to interact with the planet, okay? So at any rate, that's some of the backstory on this. Okay, so one of the things is, all right, getting rid of animal agriculture. One of the things that shows up in the stories that you read in the paper is that they're going after what are the impact of the kind of diets people say they're eating on the environment and health. But this project went like 180 degrees on that. And what we were looking at is what happened if you change the entire agricultural system to change the food and available and the nutrient adequacy, and how would that affect human society? It was going 180 degrees for how we asked the question. Because one of the things you darn well better consider is if you're going to make a statement about how diets are going to serve, you've got to make sure your agricultural system can support that. And so we went from the supply side as opposed to demand. Very rarely do people kneel before me, but thank you. Okay. We don't make any habit of that, all right? Yeah. And by the way, he is doing the phenomenal job of recording this in the back. So, all right, so just for the record, these are the data sources that we used. all independent of any influence we had over the data. And we thought it would be the most reliable data that we had to work with. And Robin and I worked on this for 4 years in the background without funding from any resources to get the data, so, or to do the project. So kind of unsullied, if you want to look at it, it was not bought. I mean, one of the first things we had to look at was what were the nutrient requirements of people of the U.S. population. So at the time we were doing this, there were 316 million people. We got nutrient requirements from the USDA and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN to get what would the requirements be for the average human in the population for 1 year, okay? We looked at 36 different nutrients. A lot of the other studies out there only look at, well, did you get them enough protein and did you get them enough calories? We looked at 36 different nutrients. And it looks more like what's on the side of a box of some of the cereals. We looked at protein, we looked at energy, we looked at amino acids, we looked at specific fatty acids, we looked at specific minerals and specific vitamins to look at 36 nutrients. And we didn't consider bioavailability from a plant resource versus an animal. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but bioavailability, let's say if you've got iron in something you eat, but you can't absorb it well, it's not very bioavailable and it can't help meet your nutrient needs, okay? So bioavailability means how well does that feed deliver nutrients you can actually use. We didn't touch that here. Okay, this goes back to the 5 dogs, okay? And Robin also has dogs. What we also figured out when we were looking at the nutrient requirements that we had to fill, we figured people were not going to get rid of their pets, all right? So we also figured out how much in terms of nutrients were we going to need to feed companion animals. And one of the things we ran into is that there is a lot of protein and fat from rendered livestock products that go into feeding our animals. And so we had to replace those with nutrients that would come from the human food supply if we got rid of animal agriculture, okay? And for the horses, we kept out 4.4 million acres for hay, okay? There was a lot of math involved in this project. Land use. Okay, if you're going to get rid of animal ag, you've got tillable land that had been used for animals that now can go to feed people. And this was something that showed up in Bloomberg back in 2018. I love this map, because if you take a look at it, okay, the yellow here, wherever, is pasture and rangeland. And that is not going to be usable for the human food supply. Okay? You have forest, which also not usable for the human food supply. Cropland, the brown here, and here's the Central Valley of California, yes. Okay? And so the crop, okay, and then you have special use, miscellaneous use, urban use, also not going to go for food. Okay? So these brown portions are where we would look at how you could convert the land use if you got rid of animals to feed people. Okay, so we had 56.2 million tillable acres in pasture, hay, and silage that we converted to crops for people, but the 415 million acres of permanent pasture or rangeland that is used by cattle or livestock currently, they were removed from food production, period, gone, okay? We reallocated these tillable acres based on the current proportion of land used for 89 different crops. And that added 1.76 million acres of fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Now, after this paper that we wrote got published, we got a fair bit of pushback on why on earth did we keep growing that much corn, grain, and soybean meal and grain crops that we had used for feeding animals or export. Why did we retain that? Which, it's a fair question. One of the things we offered was, it's the best we could do because there was no information out there. And so we were transparent with what we said we did. But I tell you what, currently the U.S. imports 51% of their fruits and 39% of their vegetables. Because there are some times of year we cannot grow fruits and vegetables. There is some land, there is some rainfall availability, there are some climatic conditions that don't allow you to grow fruits and vegetables everywhere. Okay? And these are high-value crops. If they could be produced, I'm not sure why they wouldn't be already. Okay? But again, open to further discussion. So we get into weather, climate and temperature, soil quality, elevation and slope. 70% of the fruits and vegetables grown in the U.S. are irrigated. And we do run into issues of water availability. Okay? If anybody's been looking at what's been going on with Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam and the issues with drought in the West, it speaks to this. There was also the issue of food waste, where this is information that came out of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN back in 2011, and this is for our portion of the world. And if you look at roots and tubers, and you look at fruits and vegetables, we'll focus on fruits and vegetables. 49.6% of what they attempted to produce got wasted. And that's anywhere from harvest losses all the way to the strawberries that molded in your refrigerator, okay? Whereas when you get into any of your dry materials, your cereals, your pulses, or if you get into meat and milk in particular, your losses are a lot less. And the percent of food wasted it's a risk to the farmer in part when they're trying to grow a crop that they can sell and earn a living off of. But it's also a risk to society to figure out how to reduce this so that it actually goes to feed people. But at any rate, it's one more piece. Profitability and risk comes into this. There was one paper we found after we published, or we couldn't enter it into what we had when we published, Conrad et al. 2017, where they did an analysis of the soils, the weather, the water availability, and so forth. And they indicated that there was about 356,000 more acres that could go to the fruits and vegetables they were looking at, which is substantially less than the 1 million something we allocated, okay? And they said that would only increase the fruit and vegetable supply by about 2.5% to 5.5%, okay? Not necessarily what you'd want or need if you're trying to feed the entire U.S. population. But, tell you what, it ain't over till it's over. More of this needs to be reviewed. Okay, food supply. When we're trying to figure out what food could be produced if we got rid of animal agriculture. Okay, remember that's the point of this talk after I'm going through all the rest of this. We looked at available foods, 26 from animal sources, 89 from plants. Grains that had been previously fed to animals, when we got rid of animal agriculture, were available to people, except for that for industrial use, held back for seed, or we were able to find information on aflatoxin-contaminated corn, which will not go into the human food supply. Cropland for animals went for food production for people. We took a look at the grains the way they had been used, and we rejiggered how they would be processed to maximize the amount that people could eat, okay? And in coming up with what was available for people, we only supplied nutrients from foods. We didn't look at supplements. And part of the reason for doing that is we look at food, okay, there are reports out that saying foods are the best place to get nutrients from. And also, we couldn't guarantee that everybody would be supplemented with needed supplements if we got rid of animal ag. That's a whole different societal question that we did not address. But, okay, one of us being a nutritionist, and Dr. Robin White dealing heavily in nutrition, we formulated least cost diets for people to meet their nutrient requirements using the foods that were available from the crops that could actually be produced from the land that we devoted to those crops. Okay. Sidebar for this talk. We also looked at greenhouse gases, because 9% of greenhouse gases in the US come from animal agriculture. Here's the way this sorted out in 2013 for carbon dioxide equivalents, according to the EPA, for greenhouse gas generation in the US. 50% of that 9% came from animal ags. We looked at, if we remove the animals, what the new crops were, synthesis of fertilizer replaced manure. We incinerated the human and edible byproducts because we couldn't figure out how to go through trucking them back to where they were made, and recycled the phosphorus and potassium to fertilizer. Thing that you want to look at that also doesn't get often discussed here, these are the millions of tons of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur that gets applied on the land from manure. And by the way, this will be on the internet, and glad to share this information with any of you. This is a heck of a lot of fertilizer. And if you get rid of animals, it needs to be replaced. Okay, so just to get this out of the way, when we got rid of animals, the US greenhouse gases only went down by 2.6%. Okay? And agricultural greenhouse gases went down by 28%, but not the 50% associated with animals. And part of that was counterbalanced by fertilizer synthesis and the land now allocated to food production, a different food production. And the greenhouse gases are calculated off of yields of different foods. And what we ended up finding is when we got rid of animals, here is the system with animals and the amount of food that could be produced. Here is the system without animals and the amount of food could be produced. Food production increased by 23% when we got rid of animals. And this is kind of what's out there. No, it isn't kind of what's out there. It's part of what's out there saying, you know, if you got rid of animals, look at how much more food we could have. But they don't typically get into the particulars of what kind of food they would have. Okay? With the work that we did and the land allocation schemes that we used. Okay, and by the way, for looking at any of these graphs, and you'll see them further down the line, if you see blue, and I'm hoping you're not colorblind, if you see blue, that is from animals. Those are nutrients, those are food products from animals. Green is from vegetables, red is from fruits, yellow is from grains, green, darker green is from legumes, and then you also get into nuts, into oil, and then sugar, in this case. Okay. If you take a look at the change here, the human food supply is going to have a heck of a lot more grain available in it because all of the foods that are now produced off the land that came from animals go into the human food supply. 77% of this grain was corn. Legumes, 92% was soy and soy flour. Okay? The food supply looks very different. And again, this goes back to, it's not all going to be fruits and vegetables because we do not have the wherewithal for that, at least with our current systems. Okay, so then what happened to the nutrients? Again, nutritionists, here's the 36 different nutrients that we looked at. And for reading this, the bar on the left is going to be if animal ag was in place, and the bar right next to it is going to be if you had plant only supplying the food. And so what you see is looking across these bars, once you get rid of animal ag, you have greater amounts of most amino acids, minerals, and vitamins. But let's take a look at this. Where you have a bluish bar here, it's where animal ag would be deficient and crop ag would be in better shape. We see that for choline, vitamin E, and vitamin K. But on the other side, you have where the plants-only system would be more deficient. And that's when we're looking at arachidonic and EPA and DHA, the omega-3 fatty acids. That's because they primarily come from animal products. You see the same thing with calcium. You see the same thing with vitamin A. Vitamin B12 is only going to naturally come in the diet from animal products, period. And vitamin D, everything was deficient. Okay? But here's the deal. Have you ever noticed people eat foods they don't eat nutrients? You ever notice that? I mean, you don't typically go up to the counter over, let's say at Subway, and say, "Yeah, I'd like some calcium. Would you mind giving me some cysteine while you're at it?" No, that's not what we do. So we took a look at, again, that least cost formulation diet, and this is what the diets look like kind of with the present system, where we were using U.S. production with animal ag and also the imports that we bring in from other countries. And the way this ends up looking is, again, here we have the animal part, the vegetable part of the diet, fruits, other feeds, which will be nuts and sugars and so forth, and then here's grain. About 8% grain in our current diet. The carbon dioxide equivalents, our greenhouse gas footprint is about 3.29 kilograms for this. The diet cost is about at the time was about $4. Okay, how many of you have done nutrition to look at as fed versus dry matter basis? Okay, this tells me there's a line of students who have suffered mightily, okay? Okay, so we took a look. The total food that you'd eat was about 1,500 grams, but it was only like 450 grams of those that were dry matter for what you'd have to consume, all right? And, okay, the other thing you're going to see is with these graphs I'll be showing you, on this side will be a bar graph that shows if any of these bars reached 1, the requirement was met. If they're below that, the requirement for that nutrient wasn't met. So here, just formulating off of least cost diets, off of the available food supply, what we find is calcium, vitamin D, and choline are deficient, okay? So now let's take a look at the system with and without animals. And again, scenario 1 is to the current use of U.S. production plus imports, system with animals, versus a system without animals, based on the crops that we could grow with the system I described to you. All right, let's take a look. All right, without animals, there's less greenhouse gases, which was what everybody's saying, based on the diet. The diet cost is cheaper, okay? That matters. Your food bill matters. Now you take a look at the total as fed amount versus solids, and so it was about 1,750 grams for as fed with animals, and about 600 grams we'd have to eat to balance our nutrients. But when you get over to eating this much grain, you're at about 1,500 grams as fed. But there's a heck of a lot of dry matter there, and I'm not sure I personally would want to eat a kilo of this a day. Okay? Feasibility of that, I wonder. So let's take a look at this graph. Okay, this is where the with animals are deficient. And again, we see vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, and choline. But that's for both sets of diets, with animals in the system and without. Without animals in the system, what you also find is you're deficient in calcium, vitamin A, B12, there's none, because it comes from animal products. I'll tell you a funny story about that in a minute. EPA and DHA, the omega-3 fatty acids, and arachidonic acid. We'll talk more about why those are important in a minute. I mean, they're deficient in more nutrients, and the diets ran to eat this much corn grain, this much grain in general, because we were trying to meet micronutrient needs by eating what was available that is low in micronutrients. That's where we were stuck. The micronutrients, not the macronutrients like protein and calories. Those macronutrients weren't the issue, okay? And this is the same thing that had shown up in another paper in 2016 when they tried to look at getting rid of, well, removing animal products from diets, okay? So there was also a greater food and calorie intake on the plants-only diet because we were trying to meet micronutrient needs off of foods that were not dense in micronutrients. Animal products are more dense in those micronutrients. Okay, why does this matter? It matters because you've got to feed people to meet their nutrient requirements. Okay? You meet our nutrient requirements to keep them healthy, to keep them productive. I mean, productive. We'll talk more about some of the bits and pieces of that in a minute, but part of the concern are vulnerable populations as well. Growing kids. I mean, all right, for the record, I'm slightly older than 39, okay? I hope I have finished growing, mostly out. And so my nutrient requirements aren't maybe as acute as a child's growing up and trying to fit all of the amino acids, the fatty acids, the vitamins and minerals in the small enough package that they can consume so they can grow and develop well and normally and be healthy. All right? So it's like, yeah, don't worry about me. Worry about them. Okay? Pregnant women. Okay? You know, one of the things that has bothered me no end is when studies evaluated only protein and calories and food portions. I will say for the record, and this is a technical term, no, I'll leave that. I work for the federal government and I will behave myself in my talk. Food portions don't tell you nutrient requirements, which are the thing that matter. In these studies where they look at just protein and calories and food portions, did they assume people were going to get supplemented for what those diets didn't give them? They never said, not the ones that I've read. And plants have low or no concentrations of some nutrients. Bioavailability was the issue. This is what some of those micronutrients that show up in animal foods but don't show up in plant products without supplementation are at hand. Omega-3 fatty acids. In infants, they're important for cognitive and visual development. In adults, listed for cardiovascular health. Omega-6 fatty acids. FAO is giving recommendations on those for children for the development of visual acuity. Calcium for bones, for bone development, maintenance, electrolyte, milk production, and many physiological functions. Okay? Vitamin B12, brain and nervous system, red blood cell formation, it matters. Okay, now here is the one point where you will hear a scientist become professionally snarky over something related to nutrition. One of the letters to the editor we got regarding this topic, regarding our study, they said that vitamin B12 could be obtained through lifestyle. Now, okay, for the record, I do not think I know everything, okay? Now, I am certain that I do not know everything. And so I started digging into the literature, digging into what was online, asking, how through lifestyle could you possibly get vitamin B12? And I went to what I thought was a pretty good website for giving nutrient requirements for vegan diets. And that was with the Vegan Society over in the UK. They had a lot of good information for kids, for adults, for different physiological states, for what you needed to supplement in your diet. And they said, you need to supplement B12. So our reply back to this letter writer, again, this is where the snark comes in, and I'll explain the last word if you don't understand. We said, you know, it is not clear the basis for the proposition that lifestyle will provide adequate B12 to meet nutrient requirements. You know, some animals such as, vitamin B12 is produced by microbes, bacteria in the guts of animals that, you know, such as ruminants. Ruminants can absorb B12 further in the gut from the ones that are produced by the microbes, which are the only ones that produce them. Other animals consume animal products. An alternative is coprophagy. Okay, what coprophagy is, way back when they were trying to understand vitamins, they decided that for chickens there was something that was a manure vitamin, okay? Because the chickens that ended up picking at the manure of cows and eating it did much better than the chickens that didn't. Coprophagy is eating poop, okay? because the vitamin B12 from the bacteria will end up there. So, never heard back from that letter writer. I hope he understood. Okay. Okay, I told you we didn't consider bioavailability, but again, the topic of this talk is what would the food supply look like if we got rid of animal ag? Okay? And bioavailability, as I mentioned earlier, it matters because it's how much of what we eat can actually be absorbed and used to meet our needs. And so for what's in the research literature, if we look at eating iron, there's about a 14 to 18% bioavailability and absorption in mixed diets and 5 to 12% in vegetarian diets. The most available source of iron is going to be heme iron, and it's going to be higher in things like beef. Okay? If we take a look at calcium, grams absorbed from one serving, I put it on a serving basis to give relative perspective, because it's not just how much can be absorbed, it's how much was there in the first place that you got. And so if we look at milk, which has one of the higher bioavailabilities and the higher concentrations of calcium, one serving is going to give you 96.3 grams. Pinto beans, 11.9 grams, kale, 30.1, bok choy, 42.5. And so when you look at children and meeting their needs for calcium, you've got to look at what might they be able to absorb and how much can they eat. And this study by Weaver et al. Said that it would be a challenge for most people to meet their calcium requirements on a plant-based diet, okay, based on the bioavailability and the amounts available. Okay, this gets us back to kids, and it gets us back to protein quality, because I tell you what, there's a heck of a lot of protein that's produced if we went plants only, but would it meet the needs in the foods that we can actually consume? Okay. DIAS, digestible indispensable amino acid score. This is a measurement that is supported by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, because what they're trying to do is look at, is the protein supply in the food that you can actually consume adequate to meet your needs? Okay? And so it looks at amino acid digestibility of proteins in the small intestine relative to a reference protein. And for example, for infants 0 to 6 months, their reference protein is the pattern of amino acids that's in breast milk. Okay? And what they say is it affects growth and tissue repair. If you are a child and you're not getting the needed amino acids that are available to you for digestion and absorption in the profile you need, it will cause stunting. Okay? Whether it's children or whether it's adult, it can affect immune function and how long an infection lasts and how badly you get it. Muscle and skeletal mass, which can affect your ability to work. Mental performance, which I have known this to affect my ability to work. I mean, your ability to make decisions, your ability to work, your mood, your sleep, detoxification of chemical agents. Okay? So it's important to look at this score in the foods that are available relative to references, and they have a variety of different references depending on the age of the population that they're looking at for consuming the diet. And this is what those numbers look like. The DIAAS values, 40.2, okay, anything over 100% means it's in excess of the limiting amino acid for that particular foodstuff. So wheat, 40.2. Corn grain, 42.4. We'd really like this number to be 100. Soybeans come close. I have a colleague who's also been looking into, though, does it matter how much phytoestrogen we consume at the same time we're consuming the soybeans? Phytoestrogens are also there. Do not have data on that myself. Peas, 64.7. Whole milk powder, we finally get over 100%. Beef, over 100%. A whole chicken egg, as opposed to just the yolk or the white, 116%. I mean, so things like soybean, they get us in range. But the animal products can do an excellent job, and especially if you're dealing with a vulnerable population or low food intakes, trying to strike a balance so you meet the needs off of the array of foods that you could bring to the table would matter. Okay, so summary. Just for that study, and then we'll sneak off into some other discussions, because one of the things I was told for this talk, it's as we look forward, what do we need to do? What should we be looking at for the future? Okay? But the summary on the study that we did is that a change in the system for one purpose, like getting rid of animal ag, has other impacts. Yeah, you'd have more food, but you'd have more nutrient deficiencies and or excess calories. And what really threw people for a loop is that what we came up with had absolutely no resemblance to the vegan diets that have been studied. You can stay healthy on a whole variety of different kind of diets, but you do need to make sure you've supplemented the nutrients that you need. And yeah, we got a small decline in greenhouse gases. And this is the citation for that paper if you want to look it up. Okay, but this whole thing opens the question, so fine. All right, Mary Beth, you've given us this, so what? You know, what do we do? And first things first, I will tell you, I cannot give you that answer. I'm not, it's above my pay grade, I am not that good, but it falls on all of us to figure out, what do we do? And what we've got to look at, I think, are competition for resources versus non-negotiable needs. I mean, if you take a look at the goals of an agricultural system, let's put the first one as feeding people and food security, okay? Then we go to non-food products. We have income, resource use, environmental impact, sustainability, and societal acceptability. Society has to buy in to how things run, which means probably opening up a conversation. Those of you who are kind of familiar with dairy cattle and farms have a different set of information from people who do not know, who are not familiar with farms. And so finding ways to communicate an understanding of what we do gets to be really important. And actually also listening to people say, have you thought about? Okay? I mean, when we're exploring agricultural systems and what we want them to be for what we need them to be, we've got to make sure we try to ask the right questions, have sound data, question our assumptions, or actually take a serious look at what are our assumptions and what are the opportunity costs. I mean, I put this picture here of, you know, the parable of the blind men encountering an elephant for the first time, and depending what portion of it they touched, this guy thought an elephant was a lot like a wall, this one like a tree trunk, this one handling the trunk was like it's a snake, this one said it's a sword, and whoever was dealing with the tail back there thought the elephant was very much like a rope. And I've got a feeling that in part, unless we do a lot more discussion and collaborative work and cross-pollination, we get into that with looking at what our agricultural systems need to be. I mean, so do we look at calories and protein and food portions? Or do we look at all nutrients and what we'd have to do to supplement the population to keep people well? Do we look at supply increase? I found one paper that made me crazy. This is giving me flashbacks to that paper, where they figured, don't worry, the supply of food will increase to meet demand. No! You can't assume that unless you explore it and say, there's a way to do this, okay? Which goes to the actual evaluation. And then with efficiency, gross energy, or human edible or inedible portion, versus fossil fuel or alternative uses. And okay, gross energy. There's at least one paper. Are you familiar with the information out there that says beef cattle are only about 3% efficient with their energy per edible portion? Does this ring a bell? I've read the paper, and what I decided reading the paper and touching base with other people is that's based on gross energy, so they're basically also charging beef cattle for sunlight, the energy supplied by sunlight. Whereas if we got into fossil fuel or alternative uses, then you have opportunity costs. Okay? You got to go back and look at what are your assumptions, what is the basis you're looking at, and is it the basis you want to interpret on? Okay, things to consider, my opinion. Waste, we need a lot less food waste. It's going to be a lot easier to feed people if we can get the food to them. And what energy source do we want? Sun? Or sun translated to electric, or electric generated somehow else? And what does that look like? I mean, I've been no end fascinated by the vertical farming systems that are running the system off of LED lights, let's say, that are on photovoltaic, to vertically farm, let's say, lettuce. It's pretty cool. What is the efficiency there versus what we can accomplish with other systems? What are the costs? What does it look like? Okay? Water availability. Oh my Lord. If currently 70% of our fruits and vegetables are irrigated, what do we need to do to perhaps improve efficiency of water use? For the non-food products, what are alternatives in all sorts of different stripes from what we're making from plants and from animals? Supplements, I keep coming back to that. Producing enough of them and supplying enough of them so the people who need them get them. We cannot afford any kind of horrific haves and have-nots. People need to be fed so they can thrive. No, that's a little judgmental. Meeting people's nutrient requirements is very important to society for all sorts of reasons, and we need to see how we can do it. The economic impact, because farmers farm so they can earn a living, and what is it going to cost the people who want to purchase food or purchase any of the products? Non-greenhouse gases impacts on holding soil. Perennial crops do a fabulous job of that, and that's one of the things we look at the Dairy Forage Research Center. How can we retain our soil resources and use our water resources well as well? And cropping viability, depending where. Okay? And water availability, forgot earlier. Do we use hydroponics? Do we rely on rain? Do we deal with irrigation? And under what conditions? Okay, at the end of the day, I'm like a quantitative kind of person. A lot of things are subjective, but for a lot of this, we need to do something that's quantitative and integrates different pieces. So again, I'm a nutritionist. I think meeting the nutritional needs of the population is really important. Profitability to the farms is really important if they're going to be on the land as part of sustainability. Land resource use and sustainability, so on into the future, we can keep using it to produce what we need. Environmental impact. Why do I feel like I sound like headlines in the news? Use all acceptable tools. You know, I was no end intrigued also by like the GMO yellow rice that could help with vitamin A deficiencies. And there's been word that even over in the United Kingdom, they're looking more at the acceptability of GMO crops as opposed to calling them frankenfoods. I mean, I think we need to look at what society allows, and we need to look at how we can serve society acceptably with the tools we've got and with the systems we've got. We do have to evaluate if these things are actually feasible, as opposed to saying, you know, I got a really good idea. There's no way this can't work. Right. Okay. The one thing I will tell you, the last thing I have down here is ideology. This is Mary Beth's opinion. If we're looking, maybe some portion of this gets under what's acceptable to society, but it's more looking at, let's see if we can get some hard numbers for how things actually can work and see how they can be applied in the field. I mean, my background is both extension and research, and in extension, it's getting out in the field to work with the people who are actually trying to make things work. And that's crucial. We need to do that so we can move forward. So, in a world without animal ag, the way we modeled it, it wouldn't be good for the nutritional viability of people without a whole lot of other things happening. I will say that as we go forward, we need to figure out what is a sustainable balance using the resources that we've got. And that's actually wide open. It involves a lot of different choices, a lot of different information, a lot of different work going forward. I believe we can get there well. I think, one thing to remember, where we are now is not where we will be. It's just trying to make sure that where we will be is headed in the direction that we think is good. Okay? And so with that, I'd be delighted to answer any questions. Thank you. I didn't do it. No.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Hall. We'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. Just raise your hand. Questions from the audience? We've got plenty of time.
Or be careful, or I will start asking the audience questions. That'd be a lesson. No, actually, the question I would ask, how many of you have ever gotten into discussions like this about getting rid of animal ag, and what have been the things that people have thrown back at you for why they think it's a good idea?
So one that I get back a lot is that the greenhouse gas emissions that you see a lot in the charts, and like I was going to ask you that too, don't include the transportation of the animals. That's one that people like to throw back at me a lot, which I think it does.
I believe we'd have to go back to the EPA and we'd have to go back to the FAO's work, but I think like for FAO's Livestock's Long Shadow, they included everything. Including transportation, but I can't swear to that. I will tell you that a really lovely piece of work that Dr. Robert Sains, he was at UC Davis, did for the FAO was put together spreadsheets that looked at fossil fuel use that could be modified for all sorts of different livestock operations that went from growing the animal, I don't know if he had crops in there, but all the way to it becomes food, okay? And it's that kind of thing that we need. I don't know that transportation is left out, but again, the EPA report should indicate whether they did or not. Did they support it? Did they support it with any information?
No, it's usually just like it's usually just my friends that are vegans or vegetarians that like to kind of toss that back at me a little bit. But I'm pretty sure it does include transportation. I think we kind of get into the issue of people want to pile on a lot of things with animal agriculture and say, oh, well, transportation to the store is not included, transportation to the crops isn't included, that kind of stuff. It's just a really big open thing,
well,
you know.
I tell you, you know the really bad thing I did to my nephew the other day? I told him that if he was going to offer me an opinion on a story in the news, he had to tell me where he got it from. Okay? Yeah, no, but it's only fair game for them to do it to us as well. But because if you can't provide your source, we could make up anything. And we really, we need decent information, we need solid information that we can check to have the conversations we need. And it's, as much as anything, and this isn't casting aspersions on any, it's being honest with other people and with ourselves. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so on the topic of the yellow rice, could we assume that all crops could be genetically modified in order to meet those micronutrient demands in the future?
Again, outside of my field, I mean, I'm amazed at what we've done so far. Okay, so there's the question. If we could do that, how much would that change the picture? Okay? I mean, I can't speak to what is possible. I mean, one of the beautiful things about plants is they take sunlight and they take the carbon and start making things we can use. And for what a plant can make, there's only going to be so much carbon. They're still going to need water to do it. And so if you get them making other products, it's still on balance with what the plant needs to do to survive and how much it can make and then how much you extract. I mean, you could say the same, or raise the same issue with microbes, growing them in culture. I mean, again, it all goes back to what different pieces can we bring together to get what we want? How expensive will it be? Okay, there have been some things in the news of late. There's a group in China that came up with a way to make starch in the lab with an enzymatic process that is substantially more energy efficient than a plant is. First things first, as a scientist, I'm thinking, that's cool. Then I step over here and I say, you do know plants do that all by themselves, right? You know, and it's a matter. It could have all sorts of wonderful possibilities, even proof of concept for doing other things. But depending where you live, which is going to be most efficient and meet other uses? Because also the plant is making a whole variety of other compounds that might be useful to us rather than just starch. And actually again, sort of the same thing, cultured meat. Again, it's really cool. I mean, geeky science stuff. And more articles are coming out now saying, okay, how do we process this and what are the costs and so forth relative to having that beef cow out there, having a calf, and making use of resources that we can't use any other way. The 400 some odd thousand acres of rangeland and untillable pasture. There are so many things we get to question and dig into, and that's the thing. That's why I put in there using all acceptable tools. And because what was it? There was another thing that came out that said, you know, you don't want to be slamming at. This is a rough translation. You don't want to be slamming animal agriculture in areas where people can't grow crops, and that's like one thing they can rely on. Okay, or there's issues with food security and protein quality, and I mean, okay, kwashiorkor, the disease of the second child after the first child after the second child is born, when children are no longer getting breast milk, and it's issues of protein. And I think marasmus is also the same thing, but issues with energy as well. I mean, going from breast milk to grain, you know, sort of deal, or starch, it doesn't serve. So I'm starting to wander. Okay, it's looking at the whole picture and what we need to do, which no doubt will vary from place to place depending on the resources available.
Hi,
Yes.
I have a question on if anyone's researched the economic impact non-animal ag about global requirements for protein and how our market for international trade for protein has grown. A lot of developing nations rely on protein to keep growing, and it's highly unlikely they would go also to non-animal ag with us. How would that affect our income from tariffs and?
Okay, basically it's an economic question. Yeah. Robin and I very deliberately stayed away from economics here because we spent 4 years just on that. And economics are a big-time moving target. I mean, as a USDA ARS nutrition animal scientist, I won't touch that one. We did not explore it. I have not exactly my field, I have not looked at that, but there should be some ways to sort of extract it. But one of the problems you get into is kind of like what we ran into here. It's sort of dominoes. If you change one thing drastically, can you make the assumption that other things won't tumble as well? I mean, it's sort of like, all right, if we got rid of animals, what actually will happen to all those millions of tons of byproduct feeds? I mean, and we have absolutely no answer because that's not a system we work in. So I'm kind of half guessing that there aren't any good studies out there on that, but I can't swear to it. Sorry.
We have time for one more question.
Please.
Hi. My question, maybe not just a nutrition, but I'm an animal nutritionist. Is a vegetarian concept has strong correlation with a political party, whether you're in the blue states or red states, or does it have strong correlation with education level?
What people choose to eat?
Well, I know
Or I missed,
Mr. Trump likes hamburger and so forth, but aside that, my son who moved to Silicon Valley last few years, he became vegetarian. And we didn't really go into discussion, but I was wondering, higher education become more vegetarian, or there's no correlation, or I'd like to know your comment.
I don't have information on that. If I was gonna guess, I mean, no, I better not even guess. And I tell you what, I went through 22nd grade, and I'm originally from New York City, I'm sure you can tell. And I've worked with dairy cattle starting when I was 17. And I eat a varied diet that I try for moderation, probably except when it comes to chocolate, and occasionally coffee. But as a nutritionist, I'm looking at it and saying, okay, meat, cheese, salads, vegetables, what have you. I think one of the problems we have in looking at any of that, somebody has to have looked at this. One of the problems we have is that what we see in the news doesn't, gosh, I'm trying to figure out how to say things that are not going to get me in trouble. I tell you what, I guess I would wonder the degree to which what we see in the news reflects what is actually happening across the nation in different areas, which is where doing a properly run survey of what people eat for research purposes would be useful. But at this moment, I do not have that information, and if I wish to keep my job, I sure as heck am not going to comment on red and blue states. So, no, but you do raise an interesting point, and that can also get into what is acceptable to do may vary by area, but that's where I also tell you, improving our communications so that there's a better understanding of how pieces fit together would be wonderfully useful. I wouldn't mind seeing, I'd really be curious to see if kids in schools could ever learn about what food web they live in. because we do it for other animals, and this has implications for what we can do at all. I appreciate you. Even if I can't answer it, I appreciate your question.
Excellent questions, and we would like to all thank you, Dr. Hall, for your presentation. Let's give her a hand. Thank you very much for attending another educational seminar. If you'd be so kind as to fill out the evaluation form and leave it on the back table. It does next year. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
We'll get started here in about a couple more minutes with the first seminar of the day at the Dairy Forage seminar stage. So be making your way over to the stage. We'll get started here at the top of the hour. All right, we'll go ahead and get started this morning. I'll begin with a real quick introduction of myself, and then we'll turn it over to our speaker. My name is Dennis Hancock. I get to be the Center Director for the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center based here in Madison, but we also have a research farm in Prairie du Sac and a research facility in Marshfield as well. So really excited to be here this morning to introduce our last speaker of the week for our seminar series. We saved the best for last, Wayne. We really appreciate you coming down from our Marshfield unit to talk about some of your experiences with baled silage and some additional considerations here on making good quality baleage. So with that, Wayne, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, everybody here. It's good to be with you all this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And we're going to talk this morning about some of the work we've been doing primarily in Marshfield with baled silages. And I want to start out by just mentioning that I'm going to dispense with the normal extension-related how-to slides. And these are going to be more, after a brief set of introductory slides, just some specific things that we've worked on that address common questions or problems related to baled silage. And hopefully some of these things are things you've thought about or grappled with, and if we can shed some light on some of that, that'd be a really good thing. Okay, real briefly, what is baled silage? For anyone who's not aware, this is forage that's baled conventionally. It can be with a square baler or a round baler, probably most commonly with a round baler, but I certainly wouldn't say exclusively. And then wrapped in plastic film to exclude air. Options exist for individually wrapped bales on the left and those wrapped with an inline wrapper that you see here on the right. This mode is a little more efficient time-wise, requires a little less plastic. This type over here may be a little more flexible in terms of marketing and for some other reasons. For us personally as scientists, this is a little easier to work with because every one of those bales can then be an experimental unit in a statistical analysis, whereas that gets a bit more complicated if they're all wrapped together. So that's not your problem, that's our problem. Most principles of silage management are the same or similar between conventional bunker or bag type chopped silage and baled silages. However, the fermentation within baled silages is always restricted compared to precision chopped silages. And there's a couple different reasons for that. One is the lack of chopping action. In order for silages to ferment, you have to have the plant sugars come in contact with the lactic acid producing bacteria that are generally adhered to the outside of the plant. So in a baled silage like this, much of that has to occur by diffusion because they're usually baled in long stem form, whereas this is chopped, and it makes it a little easier to blend the sugars with the bacteria required for fermentation. Oftentimes, almost always in fact, baled silages have a lower moisture concentration, which we'll talk about in some depth as we go along. And then baled silages often have a reduced dry matter density, but not always. As balers have improved and baler operators have improved, we are seeing dry matter densities that are very comparable to the 15 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot. That's a typical threshold for good corn silage. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. Okay, just briefly, the idea when you make silage is to take plant sugars and convert them primarily into lactic acid. This is a favored acid because it's the strongest acid and it's the most capable of driving the pH down, which provides stability to the silage mass. There's two types of fermentation into lactic acid. One is homofermentative. You'll see that you take a simple sugar and produce lactate, very little else. And then there's a heterofermentative type, which has multiple pathways where, again, you take those simple sugars and you get lactate plus a whole bunch of other stuff. The Buchneri products that you may have heard about are actually a form of this type of fermentation. And what's attractive in that regard is the production of acetate, which has antimycotic properties. So, and it helps to facilitate extended bunk life. Okay, just real briefly, there are very, very few published examples of baled compared to precision chopped silages where the two silages are made at the same moisture concentration. If you'll notice, this study was done or published 30 years ago. It's out of Canada. They had baled and chopped alfalfa grass silage. It was relatively wet, about 61% moisture. And what we have here is a comparison of the pH decline as a function of fermentation time. And you will notice that for the chopped silage, the pH decline is much more rapid, and the final endpoint is considerably lower than it is for the baled silage. And that relates back to the conditions that I described in the previous slide. So it's important to keep in mind we are talking about a little bit different kind of fermentation. Now, another thing that we touched on earlier is that most baled silages are drier than conventionally chopped silages. That's not exclusively true, but it generally is true. And in this same dated publication, again with alfalfa grass forages, they baled these forages at a high moisture concentration, 60 to 65%, or what I would describe as an ideal moisture concentration, The normal recommendation for baled silages, according to Kevin Shinners here at the University of Wisconsin, is 45 to 55% moisture. So that's the kind of the normal target that you shoot for. You'll notice that the pH decline is much more rapid for the wetter material. Moisture does facilitate fermentation compared to the drier, ideal moisture baled silages. Now, please file that away, and we'll talk about that a little bit in subsequent slides. All right, what I want to do for the rest of the presentation is just talk about a couple of different questions, concerns, problems that are presented to us that we've done some research on, and just briefly talk about them within the context of what happens if this happens, whatever this is. We get all kinds of questions, and I hope this sheds some light on some of the common ones that we do get at the center. First one I want to talk about is bale cutting mechanisms within the baler. A lot of balers, and this is the one we actually have on the farm at Marshfield. I am a federal employee. That is not a recommendation or an endorsement. Please make sure you understand that. That happens to be the one that we have, okay? I like it, but I probably would like others too. But in this particular unit, we do have retractable cutting knives. They're 3 inches apart, there are 15 knives in a 4-foot wide baler, which gives you a theoretical cut of about 3 inches. And you can choose from within the cab of the tractor whether you wish to engage them or not. We do get questions about this. You may have seen this marketed where it's often said or suggested that if you use a cutting mechanism within the baler, you can get more forage in the bale. There's also an additional suggestion that because you're cutting this into coarsely, but into much smaller pieces than would be long stem, that it may improve fermentation for the reasons that we were talking about with chop compared to baled silages in previous slide. We did a project, Matt Akins and I, at Marshfield, and in most of our studies, the operator maintains about a 5.5 mile per hour ground speed, unless there's some reason specifically for them not to do that. That seems to work quite well. And in this particular experiment, we baled alfalfa at 4 different moisture concentrations, from basically low end of ideal up to quite wet. The normal goal or threshold recommendation for baled silage is that you'd like at least 10 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot. And at these different moisture concentrations, you can see that we were well ahead of that, except when you got to the really wet material, and then we fell a little bit short. But in terms of the cutting mechanism, I do want you to look at the difference between cut and uncut. And that looks like a very small difference, but it's probably statistically significant. In my experience, when you look at dry matter density, wet bale density, wet bale weight, dry weights, some of those are going to turn up statistically significant by comparison more than half the time. Now, how much? Usually it's less than 5% difference or so. It's not a huge amount, typically, at least within our studies. What I've got here on this slide, I've plotted for the same study, lactic acid as a percent of dry matter, and plotted that as a function of moisture concentration. And then on the right, the final pH of the silage as a function of moisture concentration. And in this analysis, the dark black line represents the cut material, and the hash line represents the uncut or long stem material. And you will notice that the cut material does in fact maintain a higher percentage of lactic acid, concentration of lactic acid, across virtually this whole range of moisture concentrations. Those two lines are statistically distinct. They are different. Now, in practical terms, they're not a lot different, but they are different. The same thing applies here. The cut material maintained a lower pH across this entire moisture range. Generally, that ranged from about 0.1 to 0.15 pH units. And as a result of this, I think if you have a vendor suggest to you that you can improve fermentation by using a cutting mechanism, that's probably a true statement. I wouldn't argue with them. I think that is in fact true. Now, the bigger question is that difference in pH of benefit to you? There's a lot of reasons why you might want a cutting mechanism in your baler. Principal one being facilitating blending of baled silage into a total mixed ration or some kind of a blended feed product. But I think to pay extra money for that small difference is a bit questionable. And so I'll leave it at that. Another thing that we've done some work with, that's a very common question, is what happens if you have wrapping delays? A very common question. I've baled all the material. The person I'm renting the wrapper from has not showed up. How long do I have before this really becomes a problem? Or I baled all the material and we get a torrential downpour and I can't get the stuff out of the field. How long do I have before my silage becomes a very compromised product? We did an experiment with this at Marshfield, and I need to set this up a bit. What we did, we had brown bales of alfalfa, and we wrapped them either immediately on day 0, within a couple of hours, or after a 1, 2, or 3 day delay. So that would be up to 72 hours later. And if you'll notice in these graphs, these points are kind of clustered. This would be, immediate. These over here would probably be a 72-hour delay. There's some messiness in the middle. But all these slides are set up the same. And what I have plotted these against was the internal bale temperature at the time the bale was wrapped. So with a 72-hour delay, you can see that we had internal bale temperatures up around 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It was pretty hot. So this is water-soluble carbohydrates or sugar, which is a substrate for fermentation. And you notice we get a linear decline and a pretty substantial compromise in the amount of sugar that's available for fermentation because of the respiration that occurred by not wrapping those bales. Actually, the buffering capacity also increases, which is detrimental to fermentation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But if you look at the production of total acids, fermentation acids, you see a decline and then a kind of a plateau after you get out here at 48 and 72 hours. Production of lactic acid declines with a wrapping delay in a linear fashion. And you'll notice that the final pH, although this is a bit messy, does tend to increase fairly substantially as a result of delayed wrapping. In terms of quality, which may be what you're really interested in, I think most of you know about heat damage protein. Extension services have been really good about educating people on that. I should point out that in that Maillard reaction, which causes proteins to be damaged and then unavailable to the animal, moisture actually functions as a catalyst in that reaction. So this is more problematic in wetter material compared to dry hay. And you see a, fairly rapid increase, particularly out here after 1 and 2 days worth of delay in unavailable protein. And for energy here measured as TDN, it's kind of a plateau between 0 and 1 day, and then it falls off fairly substantially thereafter. As a result of this study, we kind of came up with the recommendation that while bales should be wrapped as quickly as possible, and you'll see recommendations from 2 hours up to 48 hours, This particular study would suggest that damage within the first 24 hours is fairly minimal. Once you get beyond that, it becomes much more serious. Another question we sometimes get is, what about silage fermentation in extremely cold weather? And this is a pretty common situation in central Wisconsin where it can get very cold very quick and not too long from now. Some years ago, we looked at baling some fall-grown oats, and these forages were baled about the 15th of November. And we had one set of bales that was harvested at boot stage and another that was in an early heading stage of growth. These were both variety Vista. And we plotted here the internal bale temperature as a function of days from the 15th of November. And you will notice that the temperature declined very quickly and then remained below freezing in the center of those bales till about the 15th of April. This was an extremely cold winter. It was really quite brutal. And so it may be a bit of an anomaly, but that's what happened. And obviously we sampled these bales at different time intervals over that course of this. And you'll notice that up until we got out here to where this temperature actually crossed the freezing line, we basically got no fermentation whatsoever with either set, virtually none. And I can tell you when we sampled those bales, that material was just as green as it was the day we put it in there. Once temperature started to rise in the center of that bale, then we got fairly active fermentation. I didn't put the slide in here, but these plants were very, very highly sugared. We had some evidence of a yeast type of fermentation that produced a lot of ethanol. That can be a problem with really high sugared forages. And in that light, feeding them back there before they fermented probably actually would have been a good thing. But that's a separate problem, and I'm not really prepared to talk about that one today. Another problem is aerobic stability. We get questions about this. I've gotten questions from South Dakota and all over the place. The normal kind of situation where this comes up is, I have bales in an inline wrapper and I want to sell them, but I'm going to have to expose them to do that. How long do I have before they deteriorate? How quickly does the purchaser have to use them? Or I have cattle 20 miles away on a pasture in the wintertime or some other type of setup, and I need to haul silage bales to those cattle, and it doesn't make sense to haul them one at a time. I want to put them on a trailer and haul a whole bunch of them, but maybe I have to expose them to do that. How long do I have before they deteriorate? Now, to set this up, I'd like to tell you that we're incredibly smart and plan everything perfectly, but in this particular case, I'd have to be honest and say that's not the case. In this particular experiment, we were all set up to do a hay project, and about 24 hours before the material would have been ready to bale as dry hay within that project, we got a freak rainstorm that deposited, I don't know off the top of my head, something on the order of about a quarter-inch of rain. So the farm manager, Scott Foreman, gave me a call and said, what do you want to do? And we basically called a bit of an audible and decided, well, how about if we put propionic acid-based preservative on this material and wrap it as silage? Had some questions about, what are the consequences of doing that? And then would go on and look at aerobic stability in these forages after we remove the plastic sometime later. So we baled these alfalfa grass forages that had been rained on at 52 or 44% moisture and stored them over winter for 242 days. And at the time we removed the plastic, you will notice that actually the application of propionic acid-based preservative at different rates, and These rates were simply applied by using the different pumps that are on the applicator associated with our baler, actually modestly suppressed fermentation to some degree. This is pretty evident here in total fermentation acids. There's some reduction in lactic acids. There's better utilization of water-soluble carbohydrates and so forth. The ideal moisture material fermented better than the dry material, which you would also expect. Okay, after 242 days, we removed all the plastic and set these bales on wooden pallets on a concrete pad and monitored the surface temperature in those bales for 11 days. And this was done in May, and the mean maximum temperature during that time period was just under 60 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll notice very quickly that the control bales that received no preservative demonstrated by increased temperature considerable evidence of aerobic deterioration. The very mild rate did exhibit some evidence of that, but it was quite different than the control. And then, quite frankly, the two larger or higher rates of application got very little heating over an 11-day period at a time when the temperature certainly would support aerobic deterioration. Now, after those 11 days, we went back and sampled the surface of those bales again. So what I've put up here is the original analysis that I showed you on the previous slide. And then after 11 days of exposure, there's a couple things I need to point out. Compared to up here, you'll notice in the control bales, there was a very large increase in pH. It's very substantial. Telltale sign of aerobic deterioration is always an elevated pH. You'll notice water-soluble carbohydrates were utilized during respiration. They're far less here than they were up here. There's a pretty large reduction in lactic acid and also in the total acids produced or available. However, you'll notice that the changes in these two higher rates were really very, very minimal. So this was very encouraging. And then we decided we'd repeat that because that's always a good idea. You don't want to get too excited about one study because there could be all kinds of things that might prove not to be true. But in this particular experiment, we used grass, meadow fescue, orchard grass, and tall fescue. These were ensiled at a relatively low moisture, just under 40%. They were stored for 84 days. And then they were exposed for 2 weeks in October. And again, the mean maximum air temperature was just under 60 degrees Fahrenheit. You will notice in this particular study, we only used the second and third pump on our applicator. The rates were fairly similar to what they were in the previous study. And again, we got excellent temperature control with the surface with these two rates of propionic acid product compared to the control where we got a lot of evidence of aerobic deterioration. One other interesting thing that happened, and I have no explanation for this right off the top of my head, is that in the control bales of tall fescue, we got a really, really strong response. This is maximum surface temperature over here, compared to the meadow fescue and the orchard grass. I can't tell you why, but I thought I'd be obligated to point that out to you. Can't explain that right off the top of my head. These are fairly similar grasses in terms of their physiology, but that was what happened. Okay, now most of the time when you talk about aerobic deterioration of silages, the primary theory or the conventional theory is that that's usually initiated by yeast. So we did some yeast counts on these bales, on the surface of these bales, as a function of the 3 application treatments with the grasses. And you'll notice that the counts of yeast are 2 orders of magnitude greater. Now this is a log number here, so that's like a factor of 100. greater, which is consistent with the notion that you're improving aerobic stability when you apply this propionic acid-based product. I think it's important to point out that I'm not standing here advocating that you should necessarily do this. It does cost money to do this. I mean, we're probably looking at somewhere between $6 and $12 a bale to put that on at rates in that kind of range. And that may not be something that you want to do. But I think if you are in a situation where you know that you're going to have to expose bales for a period of time, for whatever reason, and it's at a time of the year when aerobic deterioration could be a problem, might be something you want to think about. Please don't consider this a recommendation. Do consider it an additional tool for your toolbox. It might be something you want to do if situation is such that it makes sense to you. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about wet silages. Now, back in the beginning of the presentation, I showed you this graph where we had high moisture baleage represented by this yellow bars, this is pH, and ideal moisture baleage represented by these green bars. And we talked about there's a difference in pH, a more rapid descent with higher moisture, lower final pH, and so forth. It may have occurred to you when I was mentioning that, well, why don't we just bale them wetter? That would seem logically to make a little bit of sense. There's really three main reasons why that's typically not recommended. And the first two are probably not as important as they once were. The first one is related to safety. You have a 4 by 4 foot round bale in that 60% moisture range that can weigh roughly 1,500 pounds, at least the ones coming out of our baler do. And if you are handling those with an undersized tractor under uneven ground, that's a legitimate safety concern. When I started working with round bale silage at the University of Arkansas, and people had not dealt with this very much, there was a lot of bales that were handled like that with undersized tractors. And if you've ever been to Fayetteville, Arkansas, you know that that's the definition of uneven terrain doesn't even come close to describing some of that. So safety is a concern. Also, the balers themselves. Now, today, most balers do handle wet bales better. You have silage specials that are marketed that way and so forth. But it's important to remember that they do generally handle drier bales better than they do wet ones. I know with our baler, which I said before, I like fine. When we get up about 65% moisture, we start having problems with wrapping, tying, and all sorts of things. Occasionally it becomes a little frustrating. So even though equipment design has improved dramatically, you know, these balers are still co-equally designed to bale dry hay. So, you know, the main reason, though, that we do not recommend baling wet silages is the potential for a clostridial fermentation. And in a clostridial fermentation, you have a secondary fermentation. Usually it does not occur initially. You have Clostridia, which attack free sugars, lactic acid, and protein, and you wind up with production of butyric acid and ammonia. And if the concentrations of that become bad enough, it will significantly affect intake. This is more of a problem and has been researched more thoroughly in Europe, where they typically do not wilt forages. There's a long history of them concentrating on eliminating clostridial products and clostridial fermentations. Because we tend to wilt things, hay crops in this country fairly regularly, it's been less emphasized, but it can be a real problem. What I've plotted here, set this up, this is the butyric acid concentrate, or total fermentation acids, excuse me, in 283 round bale silages from 10 different experiments in Marshfield, Wisconsin. And a couple things here are kind of interesting. Number one, many of these bales were intentionally mismanaged or created in ways you normally wouldn't recommend as part of an experiment. You have to compare the good with the bad in any experiment, so you have to document what the bad is. So there's a lot more variability in this than there might normally be. But when you look at total fermentation acids as a function of bale moisture, that still explains more than 2/3 of the variability in these bales. What I've also done here is highlighted in this light green the normal recommended range. And in addition to that, the points that are in red are silages that had butyric acid concentrations greater than 0.25%. Now you're going to see, if you do a lot of reading, different recommendations on what an acceptable threshold is. Most people would tell you the acceptable threshold is none or undetectable. You'll see 0.1 in some situations, but this is probably universally going to be more than you'd really like to see. And you'll notice that once you start bumping up against the upper end of this recommended range, you start to pick up more and more of these Clostridial products. And one thing about bale silages that's a little bit different, if you think about chopped silages, when you go out across the field, you're blowing that chopped material into a truck, into a wagon of some kind, and there's a certain amount of blending that occurs with that. And then you're discharging that into a blower, or you're dumping it, and so forth, and laying it in a bunker, and there's a certain amount of blending that occurs with that. And what you wind up with is a fairly homogeneous product compared to baled silage. Now, with a round baler, at least you're applying whatever occurs and goes into that baler in layers around the outside. So you do have some element of blending. If you're using a square baler, what you bale at this end of the field might be very different from that end of the field. And it does affect the potential for picking up butyric acid products. You can have wide variability, localized spots within those bales where it's much more moist than it would be other places. You can have higher concentrations of legumes, clover or alfalfa compared to grass, and all those are things that affect the potential for production of Clostridial products. Okay, some months ago, I'm sure some of you get hay and forage grower, Mike is here, but they published an article from Dr. Henning at the University of Kentucky where he did some survey work with Kentucky round bale silages. And in that work, he has graphed a very similar thing to what I showed you just previously, but this is actually the concentration of butyric acid here as a function of bale moisture. And these, of course, came, I think, from different farms and so forth. And you'll notice, again, that there's not a lot of butyric acid until you start getting up to the upper edge of the recommended moisture range. And once you get beyond that, you start picking up Clostridial products. In this case, it's measured as butyric acid. So it's always nice when you get the same answer in more than one place. That's always a good thing. Another consideration for Clostridial problems is whether or not you've applied manure or dairy slurry, in our case, to these forages as they're growing. This is a common question in our part of the state. You know, it's been a wet fall or a wet spring, or both a wet fall and a wet spring. My lagoon is full. I've got to put this somewhere or it's going to run over, and that creates all kinds of other issues. So can I put it on alfalfa? And in this particular experiment, we had 4 treatments. There was a control where we applied no slurry. We applied it to stubble after the preceding harvest, and then after a 1 and 2 week delay. You know, this kind of a slurry product does have the potential to burn alfalfa back. We're not going to talk about that here, but it does actually have that potential. And our environmental microbiologist, Mark Borkhardt, worked out a qPCR procedure to look at clostridial counts associated with these treatments. And you will notice a couple of things. First, if you don't put any manure on, you have lower counts than if you do. The longer you delay application, the higher the counts get. And after fermentation, represented by the black bars, compared to the pre-ensiled counts, the counts are always higher. Now, if you've got a lot of experience with silage, I don't think any of that really surprises you. And there was not a great production of clostridial products in these silages because we did bale them quite dry. And that is one way to prevent this kind of a problem. However, this does demonstrate a considerable amount of risk. And as Rich Muck, before he retired, would recommend, and also me, based on what I've seen, this might be a really, really good time if you have the capacity to put on a lactic acid producing inoculant. If you've put manure on like that, you might want to consider doing it. And Rich Muck often would recommend when you had a forage that was at risk for Clostridia, you might want to dry it an additional 10 points compared to what you normally would. And that'd be a pretty good hedge against that kind of a problem. I've talked about this, but you might want to know, why we really care about it. What I have here are two forages, or two silages that we produced at Marshfield, and the green bars represent different concentrations of butyric acid in those silages. And these are both pretty high. The red bar represents the concentration of ammonia nitrogen, which is also quite high. Normally, anything above about 10% of the total nitrogen is indicative of a clostridial problem. So these are both, there's clostridial activity in both of these. And what I did was ship these to a former partner in crime at the University of Arkansas, and he ran them through, or had a grad student, Valens, ran these through some gestating sheep. And with the greater concentrations of clostridial products over here, you can see that you get about a 10% depressed intake of both dry matter and organic matter compared to the lower concentration. Please understand that both of those are way too high. So we don't have anything there that's that minimal butyric acid to really compare it against. But this is the kind of problem you can get into, and it's why we're concerned about it, or at least one reason. Okay, the last thing that I want to touch on is dry silages. And this has been a subject of some of our recent work in some ways. I've mentioned Rich Muck. He was the silage guru at the Dairy Forage Research Center for many, many years and retired fairly recently. But he said back about 35 years ago, an implication for management is that fermentation, or decreasing pH, is relatively unimportant in producing high quality dry silages. And that's kind of interesting, because I think the mindset that we all have, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, is that you want to drive fermentation. And under normal circumstances, that's true. You get stability from a low pH, and that's really important. However, not if the material is dry. Now, of course, Rich made this comment back in an era when there was a lot of oxygen-limiting silos, upright silos around. But my observational trend is that producers, and I would include the managers at the research station in Marshfield, generally are moving toward drier baled silages. And that places increased emphasis on excluding air and probably a lot less on fermentation. All right, let's go back to our 243 round-baled silages that we produced from 10 studies at Marshfield. In this particular case, I've plotted the concentration of lactic acid as a function of bale moisture. What I want you to concentrate on is the cluster within that red circle. You'll notice at these very, very low bale moistures, you get very minimal production of lactic acid, and in many, many cases, you may not even be able to detect it at all. Now, once you get to the recommended range, you start to see an increase in the production of lactic acid, and again, moisture will drive fermentation so that it continues to increase. Again, despite all the variability in conducting these various studies, moisture alone represented about 2/3 of the variability within that relationship. So that's actually quite high, I think. But the key thing to take home here is this does not mean that these bales here were no good, that the quality was no good. They were perfectly excellent quality forage. What it means is you're preserving those bales by excluding air with very little benefit from fermentation. And that poses some interesting things which we'll talk about here as we wrap this up. I thought I would go ahead and throw this in too, because the previous slide probably doesn't represent quite as well what actually happens. I've limited this to 24 round-baled grass silages from a single experiment. And basically, what I've done is plot the same thing. Concentration of lactic acid is a function of bale moisture. And you'll notice that the curve is a bit more complex. In this case, it's actually a quartic function, which is just a fancy way of saying there's 3 bends in the line, okay? At some point back here, when this material is really dry, you get 0. And then as you get a little bit of moisture, you see an increase and a bit of a plateau until you start to approach this threshold of the recommended range. Then the production of lactic acid takes off. And if you extend this out to where it's very wet, which I'll show you in the next slide, this will actually decrease because you're likely to pick up a clostridial response which will metabolize lactic acid. I want to return to Dr. Henning's article in Hay and Forage Grower, and he basically has plotted the same thing here, represented by these green dots. Have concentration of lactic acid, represented by the green dots, as a function of bale moisture in his survey study. You will notice very little production up to this initial threshold of the recommended range, then you start to see an increase. Now, in this particular survey study, he had some bales that extended to quite wet, and you'll see that many of them have decreased concentrations of lactic acid because it's been lost to clostridial activity. Okay, the last thing that I really want to touch on before we quit here is related, and it's a common question that we get in central Wisconsin and a concern. And that is, what about situations when I really want to bale dry hay, but I'm just in an environment or a circumstance where I cannot get it dry enough to store properly? And many of you know that as these bale packages get bigger and bigger and bigger, the sensitivity to spontaneous heating in dry hay increases. It becomes a really difficult eye of a needle to thread. So we thought we'd do an experiment to actually look at that a little bit. And in this experiment, which was just published actually this week in Applied Animal Science, we had a 2x2 factorial arrangement of treatments. Bales either received a preservative or they received 7 layers of plastic wrap. So there's actually 4 treatments in there. The moisture content was right in that range where it becomes problematic, at least in Marshfield. You can get things down to 25% pretty easily, but getting them down to 15% is a whole other challenge. So we hit this pretty well in terms of setting it up. Now, this propionic acid-based product was applied at 0.27% of wet bale weight. And that actually is a bit low in this moisture range based on the label. However, this moisture is based on a laboratory determination. The determination made by the applicator on the baler was more like 20%, in which this application rate is on target. Now, normally, in my experience with our baler and our setup in Marshfield, the estimate on the baler and what we get in the laboratory is not that different. This was a fairly unique range. I can't explain why, it just was. But to be fair, I need to point that out. All right, now we measure heating in these bales during storage. And to do that, we used a heating degree day concept, which is similar to a growing degree day concept. You have a threshold, and whatever increment the temperature is above that, you kind of subtract that out and then sum it over the entire storage period. Basically, read this as just a measurement of heat. It's one number that represents how hot that bale got and how long it stayed that way, okay? You'll notice that when I considered all the bales, all of them that were wrapped incurred very, very minimal amount of heating units compared to those that were unwrapped. Now, the unwrapped, of course, would include some that had acid on and some that did not. But these are all highly significantly different, okay? If you look only at the unwrapped bales and compare the preservative versus the control, despite the fact that we may have underapplied this acid just a little bit, there is a significant difference at 30 days and 45 days where we did get some control of heating based on the application of the preservative. We did have a fairly significant differential out at 84 days, which was the extent of the experiment, but that was not statistically significant. If you're to look at dry matter recovery, didn't matter whether they had a preservative or no preservative. If they were wrapped, we recovered after 84 days an extraordinarily high percentage of the dry matter in those bales. And that was not anywhere close to significantly different. However, for the unwrapped bales, we did get improvement in dry matter recovery when we applied the propionic acid-based product. If you want to look at the recovery of energy, what I have here is the energy expressed as net energy of lactation initially for all the bales. For those that were wrapped, there was not a difference there between that and the initial, which means we really, from a statistical standpoint, did not lose any energy as a result of fermentation. However, when they were not wrapped, you see there was quite a loss. Also, these do tend to be different. So anyway, this concept of wrapping bales at a dry level when you're in a position where we're not going to get them dry, it's going to rain, I have to get this off, I'm going to lose it if I don't get it off. I think it holds some promise. Now, we haven't followed up with this, but in an initial trial, it was quite effective. If you extend that a little bit and look at the fermentation in these really dry silages, you'll notice the pH remained pretty high. There's very, very little production of lactic acid or total acids. And also, one thing that happens when you apply a propionic acid-based product during fermentation is you do tend to pick up increased concentrations of alcohols. And that did occur also in this particular experiment. We went ahead and looked at, after exposure, at aerobic stability. And in this particular case, we exposed these bales from early November through early December, middle of December. And during this time period, it was quite cold in Marshfield. And we did not measure any kind of a temperature response between bales that had been wrapped or bales that had preservative or no preservative and so forth. However, when I did go back and look at these yeast counts, you will notice that there's higher yeast counts, at least numerically, when you don't apply the preservative, which is consistent with what we've talked about in past slides. Now, it's important to note, again, this is a log scale. This number here is actually about 4 times as large as this one over here. So that's consistent with what we've seen before, that there is some improvement in aerobic stability when you expose those bales. With that, I'm going to stop and take any questions that you might have. And yes.
to silage, or is that something that can, I think you mentioned it in grasses too, is that something that can be done with alfalfa?
Correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't understand the question. But you were asking whether it made any difference, basically what the forage type was when you applied acid, right? No, you can apply it to any kind of hay crop.
Is it going to be at a different percentage because it was maximized at either 0.44 or 0.8 as far as the benefits of it in the silage in that one chart you had?
The two studies that we've done, it would appear that on our applicator, which is the second highest pump in terms of delivery rate, which produced somewhere between, excuse me, 0.4 and 0.5% of wet bale weight, that you got the maximum benefit. To go beyond that, it did not appear that it provided any additional benefit. Okay? Other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you think, speculate, do you think a large square bale that's probably denser would have better aerobic stability than a large round, or no difference?
I can't speak directly to that, but I think there's a whole lot of variables in that question.
Repeat the question for the.
Yeah. Mike asked if a large square bale, which he's presuming will be more dense, if that would have better aerobic stability after exposure than a round bale. I can tell you that the yeast and mold counts in the core of a round bale are not as high as they are at the surface. So that kind of speaks to your question, but I know with our operator, well, actually, he's in that picture, and I need to give him credit. That's the field crew there for the University of Wisconsin. They do a wonderful job. So they're responsible equally for what you've seen. But Scott Fisher is capable of producing very, very high dry matter densities in those round bales, which actually can get up well over 15 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot. So I think it's operator dependent is what I'm trying to tell you.
Is it going to be that high on the outside of the round bale?
I've only ever measured them exactly on a whole bale basis. I would think not, but those are whole bale measurements.
Any other questions? Well, Wayne will be around for a little bit longer if you'd like to stick around and ask a few questions privately. I do want to say that if you did not get a copy of the handout, there is a copy of the handout over on the desk. And all of these seminars are being recorded and will be placed on the web on a YouTube channel for the World Forage Analysis Super Bowl. And on the back side of this little card that's sitting in a chair over there and also on the table is the link to that. And then you can also pick up another card that has the link to our webinar series for the Dairy Forage Research Center. We do those twice a month on the first and third Wednesday of every month at 3 p.m. Central Time. We conduct those webinars and present research like what Wayne has presented today of what's going on at our center. So with that being said, let's thank Wayne for a great presentation. And thank you all for coming out. We hope you enjoyed it and I hope you'll come back next year. Thank you so much.